I've gone over a few studies, many of which were done by U.S. military officers themselves, presented as reports or as theses or as special studies by these two different institutions. And what I gather was that the counterinsurgency movement in the Philippines against the hook was always and still is being cited as a classic example of a successful counterinsurgency movement. So what you mentioned about the counterinsurgency movement in the Philippines against the hook as being cited as an example in the manual of the School of the Americas counterinsurgency training program in Fort Benning, Georgia. I'm not surprised that that is the case because in the Philippines during that time, the U.S. counterinsurgency program succeeded in winning the hearts and minds of the Filipino masses. But winning the hearts and minds of the Filipino masses and causing the Filipino masses to forget about revolution, to forget about insurgency, and to embrace the Philippine government, which was then a client state of the U.S. government, did not necessarily mean that democracy existed. It simply meant that U.S. hegemony went unchallenged. It simply meant that the client state set up by the Philippine government was no longer threatened by any insurgency. So the defeat of the insurgency movement led by Luis Taruk meant that U.S. imperialism was no longer challenged, that it no longer felt threatened, that it felt secure and confident that the Philippines would become hospitable to American business and commercial and broadly economic interests in the Philippines, and that things would return to normal as usual. Keep in mind that at this time the Secretary of Defense was Ramon Magsaysay, and Ramon Magsaysay maintained very close relationship with one of the leading CIA operatives.
Edward Lansdale.
Yeah, Edward Lansdale, who befriended Magsaysay, who even shared living quarters with him, as I understand, and whom Magsaysay had relied on day in and day out for advice. And when he became and when he decided to run for the presidency, he of course had the blessing and the support of Edward Lansdale. The slogan when he was running for the presidency was, he was the man of the masses. I remember that as a child growing up in the Philippines, by exploiting the image of him being popular, of him mingling with ordinary Filipino citizens, especially among the poor, that Magsaysay was an unbeatable candidate, and he was of course favored by the U.S. Embassy to run. The period of the 1950s was of course a period of intense ideological struggle between the United States and its client states all over the world on one hand, and the former Soviet Union on the other. And America's counterinsurgency program was a complement to the overall U.S. policy of containment towards the Soviet Union. By the end of the 1950s and the early 1960s, of course, the Cold War was full-blown, and the Cold War was already full-blown between the former Soviet Union and the United States on one hand. And America's approach was formalized through the Foreign Assistance Act, I believe, of 1947 or 1948, I'm not sure about the exact year, signed by former President Harry S. Truman, which became, by the way, the Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine that came out of that piece of legislation signed by President Truman legitimized U.S. intervention among allied countries at first. The Truman Doctrine allowed and legitimized U.S. intervention in the elections of Greece and Italy in the late 40s and early 1950s. In Italy, in preventing the socialists from gaining political power, and in Greece by supporting a military junta from being overthrown, and furthermore, in supporting that military junta in defeating an insurgency in Greece. So the Truman Doctrine allowed for and legitimized U.S. intervention among allied countries, principally in Europe. Excuse me. And the Truman Doctrine gave the precedent for U.S. intervention in third world countries. And of course, the Truman Doctrine was followed by the counterinsurgency doctrine of Kennedy, and that counterinsurgency doctrine was followed by succeeding presidents, including Nixon, Jimmy Carter, and expanded upon by Reagan when Reagan came into office in the early 1980s. What's interesting is that during the Reagan years, what became a bad word during all previous administrations became legitimized and became official policy. And I'm referring, of course, to revolution or insurgency. And the difference is that in preceding administrations, insurgency was thought of as only being anti-American. During the Reagan years, it was realized that there could be some insurgencies that could be co-opted, that could be useful to the Americans. And so some insurgents or some terrorists could be useful tools of U.S. foreign policy. And that there needed to be a distinction made between insurgents that were useful to America's interests and insurgents that were not useful to America's interests. You see, Kennedy did not make such distinction. Eisenhower did not make that distinction, but Reagan did. And so with that distinction, Reagan had determined that an insurgency in Nicaragua could be supported, and this, of course, became the contrast. In Angola, an insurgency can be supported, and that insurgency was in the form of the UNITA, which was the right-wing guerrilla faction that fought against the MPLA, against the Portuguese in the early 1970s. And then in South Asia, the good insurgents were the Taliban and the Al-Qaeda, because they were fighting against the Soviet Union. So one could be a terrorist, but so long as you are a terrorist useful to America's interest, then you are a good terrorist. And you would be funded and you would be trained through these examples that I gave. And that if you were a bad terrorist, it meant that you're not useful to U.S. interest, that you are against U.S. interest, and that therefore U.S. military might would be sent against you to destroy you. So today, that is the same dilemma that the U.S. War on terror is finding itself in, because while President Bush had declared that you are either with us or you are with a terrorist, you have to qualify. You cannot have an ironclad and universally applicable definition of the word terrorist, because the United States reserves the right to define who a terrorist is and who an enemy is. Because even as I speak, there are terrorists within the United States that the United States is not going after or is not trying to destroy. We're talking about people like Jose Posada Carriles, for instance, who helped plan for the bombing of Cuban Airlines, in which in which all the passengers were killed, including the entire fencing team of Cuba. And Carriles was convicted in a Venezuelan court. He was able to escape from there and found his way in the United States. And up to now, Carriles has not been held for that particular offense. And then you have the former president of Bolivia, whose name I can't recall right now, who ordered the shooting of Venezuelan citizens in the city of Cochabamba who were protesting against water privatization. That government was overthrown. The contract with Bechtel was torn to pieces, and the president, following his overthrow, fled to the United States. The government of Evo Morales wants him extradited, and yet the U.S. refuses to extradite him. So we have many, many examples of terrorists that have proven useful to U.S. interests. A couple of other examples. Someone by the name of Emmanuel Toto Constant, leader of FRAPH, F-R-A-P-H, which is the initials of a Haitian organization, but which turned out to be no more and no less than a death squad. And this organization, under Toto Constant's leadership, burned down an entire slum city around Port-au-Prince, just because the residents of that slum were loyal supporters of Jean-Bertrand Aristide, who was a popular former priest and who was president of Haiti, but was overthrown by a U.S.-backed coup d'etat. Another individual, of course, is Henry Kissinger, who was a high-ranking government official, particularly in the Nixon administration, and who helped craft policies that resulted in the deaths of thousands, if not millions, in East Timor, in Kampuchea, with the aerial bombing during the Vietnam War, in Vietnam itself, in the implementation of many operations, including the use of such weaponry as Agent Orange, and then in Latin America, the formation of such connivance of military and intelligence agencies among right-wing dictatorships called the Operation Condor. This has been written about and researched on by many independent researchers. We have documents now in the National Security Archives in Washington, D.C., detailing the involvement of the U.S. government with these dictatorships in Latin America. So these are examples of why we cannot necessarily take the U.S. at its word if the U.S. says that it is fighting terrorism or that it wants to enlist your support in the fight against terrorism, because there are terrorists that the U.S. has supported and will condone and will continue funding and training, and there are terrorists that the U.S. doesn't like and whom the U.S. will go after. Yesterday was the anniversary, I believe 150th anniversary of the signing of the Bill of Rights. And at the same time, it was also the same day, yesterday, that Obama signed the bill into law, the Defense Authorization Bill, which obliterates the Bill of Rights. And so we have Obama proclaiming to the world that the United States is a champion of democracy and a guarantor of human rights. And in part of his statement, he said that Americans should not fear extrajudicial killing, when in fact the United States has been engaging in that practice for quite some time, particularly since the War on Terror began after 9/11. It's not an unfair suggestion on the part of Professor Chomsky, whom I have a very high regard for. I respect him and follow him and agree with much of what he says. And on that score, that is that one can make a case for labeling each and every president since the end of the Second World War, I mean, just to start on that alone, as a war criminal, has a lot of basis. Well, to begin with, the term war criminal was defined as a distinct crime in the Nuremberg Charter that was crafted to try the Nazi war criminals after World War II in 1945. The Nuremberg Charter defines three particular types of crimes. One is crime against peace. The other is war crimes. And the other is a war criminal. Crime against peace is, of course, specified in that document as involving the planning, the execution, implementation, and carrying out of an unprovoked war. And an unprovoked war is defined as a war of aggression. So let's keep in mind that the Nuremberg Charter was hammered out with the legal assistance of the United States, specifically to try the Nazi war criminals after World War II. The Nazi regime in Germany, to qualify as having broken, to qualify as having committed the crime against peace, was defined as having engaged in the planning and the execution, the implementation, and the carrying out of an unprovoked war. And it was shown that Germany's war against Czechoslovakia was unprovoked. It was shown that Germany's war against Poland was unprovoked. War against France was unprovoked. War against Russia was unprovoked. And that therefore, by virtue of Germany having gone to war against these countries without provocation, has committed that particular crime called crime against peace. So, if we define Eisenhower as having authorized the undue intervention in the internal affairs of Iran in 1953 and in Guatemala in 1954, countries which have done nothing wrong against the U.S., countries which have not provoked the U.S. into committing internal domestic covert operations against them, then we can say that Eisenhower had committed a crime against these countries. You see, the 1953 coup d'etat that was hatched by the CIA and authorized by Eisenhower was a crime. And the 1954 coup d'etat against Jacobo Arbenz of Guatemala through the CIA and authorized by Eisenhower, that was a crime against peace. Truman, his authorization of the intervention in Italy that I mentioned to you about, and also in Greece, which became the manifestations of the so-called Truman Doctrine. That was also a crime. Not to mention the biggest crime that I believe Truman had committed, of course, and that was the authorization of the use of the atomic weapons against Japan, which incinerated thousands of innocent Japanese civilians in an instant. JFK, his authorization of counterinsurgency program against, first of all, the Bay of Pigs invasion, which he claims he inherited from the Eisenhower administration. But if he feels that that was an illegal plan by the previous administration, he should have declined it. He should not have proceeded with the implementation of it. But he was half-hearted, and it was poorly executed. Still, he was the president, and still the buck stops with him. So he has to take as much responsibility as could be assigned to him. Not to mention, of course, a couple of other things, one perhaps more grave than the other. I'm talking about the escalation of the Vietnam War, which he also inherited from Eisenhower. Eisenhower, of course, was the president that canceled the elections in Vietnam that would have allowed Vietnam to transition from French colonialism to independence. But because he saw that Ho Chi Minh would be the likely winner in a candidate, because Ho Chi Minh was the liberation leader from French colonialism, that he was very popular, he was a beloved figure, and that the Vietnamese had wanted him to become their leader. And Eisenhower saw the prospect of him becoming president if he did not cancel the elections. And you can see in Eisenhower's memoirs his rationale for canceling the elections. You know, he said in no uncertain terms that he, referring to Eisenhower, could not afford to see Ho Chi Minh become president of Vietnam. Therefore, the elections had to be canceled, and that he had to help the French by becoming the successor foreign supervisor of Vietnam. And so Eisenhower began the practice of sending first military advisors, even though those military advisors were no different from soldiers, because they were also already engaged in fighting. And then Kennedy continued that instead of de-escalating and withdrawing from Vietnam. And so Kennedy oversaw the assassination of Vietnamese President Ngo Dinh Diem, and that is under the Nuremberg Charter. Assassination is the taking away of someone's life without judicial approval, and that is, of course, defined as murder. So the assassination of Ngo Dinh Diem under this law was defined as murder, and this happened with Kennedy's consent and authorization and knowledge. Things may have developed perhaps in unexpected ways, but there are things that you authorize which would bring about things you don't expect. Nonetheless, you are the root of those things, because those things that you did not anticipate but which happened anyway should not have happened without you starting the process. So following Kennedy, we had Johnson. Johnson, of course, committed murderous policies in Vietnam, including the authorization of an expanded or escalation of U.S. military involvement through the infamous Tonkin Gulf Resolution that is corrupt. You see, to use a bogus incident as a pretext for expanding U.S. military involvement in Vietnam is corrupt. It is corruption. And it's unforgivable. And it was also during Johnson's time that the use of bombing to target Viet Cong and then North Vietnamese military positions beyond the border between North and South Vietnam was, of course, against international law. Outside of Vietnam, Johnson also intervened in such places as the Dominican Republic. He quelled nationalist rebellion in the Dominican Republic to restore a very popular president. And sad to say, he labeled that popular movement as a rebellion or an insurrection which needed to be quelled. So he authorized U.S. Marines to be paratrooped into the Dominican Republic and to intervene in that country and to preempt the establishment of a nationalist, independent-minded government. So for that alone, he could be tried and perhaps sentenced to many years in jail. He was followed by Richard Nixon. Of course, Richard Nixon escalated the war even more, and he ordered the bombing of North Vietnam, particularly the North Vietnamese port of Hai Phong. Nixon also authorized the incursion into the military incursion into the territory of Laos, which was supposed to be a secret military operation to go after Viet Cong and North Vietnamese regulars that were being transported from North Vietnam to South Vietnam to fight alongside the Viet Cong guerrilla forces. And the intention of the Laotian incursion was to disrupt and destroy supplies and supply routes, the so-called Ho Chi Minh Trail, and prevent the inflow of supplies and personnel from the north to the south. And of course, that did not work, and the violation of the territory of a neutral country was, of course, a serious breach of international law. And Nixon was answerable to a court of law. Nixon, of course, domestically engaged in violation of the U.S. Constitution itself by authorizing the Watergate break-in. And for that, he should have gone to jail, but he was pardoned by his successor, Gerald Ford. Let's keep in mind that it was during his presidency that the military coup d'etat in Chile happened in 1973 through the CIA, but also through the invaluable assistance of his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger. Following that coup d'etat, Salvador Allende himself was killed, presumably through self-inflicted rifle shot, but nonetheless a death that was made inevitable by the chain of events that began with a military coup d'etat led by right-wing Chilean Army General Augusto Pinochet, with the assistance and knowledge and support of the U.S. government through the CIA. Following that coup d'etat, thousands of innocent Chilean citizens, including citizens from third countries like Spain, were killed, and their only offense was by being active in the political movement in their own respective countries, by being active in student protests, being active in labor issues, by being active in human rights issues. But nonetheless, the military regime that came to power made no distinction between these political activities on one hand and what it deemed as a threat against the security of the state. So all of these activities became threats, quote unquote, to the state. Another infamous program that the Nixon administration had supported, this one involving military, security, and intelligence agencies of various right-wing governments in Latin America, was the so-called Operation Condor. Operation Condor was a clandestine operation among these governments, wherein they would exchange intelligence with each other about their own citizens that were within the territory of the other country. And through the process of reciprocity, that they would do a favor to one country by arresting or putting under surveillance or punishing an activist found in their own territory that was a national of their neighboring country. So it was essentially a quid pro quo arrangement between and among the right-wing dictatorships. And of course, the operations that they would engage in included, among other things, assassinations. The most famous assassination was the assassination of Orlando Letelier, along with his secretary, Ronnie Moffett, in the streets of Washington, D.C. Orlando Letelier was the Chilean ambassador to the United States during the term in office of Salvador Allende, when Salvador Allende was overthrown in Chile by the right-wing dictatorship. Orlando Letelier remained in the U.S., and it was during his stay in the U.S. that the Chilean intelligence agency, DINA, D-I-N-A, kept track of him and managed to plant a bomb underneath his car, which was timed to detonate at some point while he was driving around Washington, D.C. And of course, this happened, finally happened, and this became a celebrated case. At first, it was charged that Orlando Letelier was carrying bombs, which was ridiculous, and that these bombs exploded and killed himself and his secretary inadvertently. And as it turned out, resulting from investigative journalism and used as an evidence in court, that it was actually DINA, D-I-N-A, the Chilean intelligence agency, that planted the bomb, and that this act was carried out in part under the Operation Condor. And of course, the documentation for this is found in the National Security Archives, acquired through the Freedom of Information Act. So Nixon became famous, of course, for carrying out other forms of atrocities through the policies and programs that he authorized to try to defeat North Vietnam and the Viet Congs and to impose U.S. hegemony in Vietnam. This included the use of Agent Orange, which defoliated the countryside of Vietnam. This included the infamous Christmas bombing, which was intended to pressure the North Vietnamese negotiators in the Paris peace talks. And the Christmas bombings included the bombing of the city of Hanoi, and the destruction of the North Vietnamese port of Haiphong. This, of course, resulted in the deaths of hundreds of innocent North Vietnamese civilians. If one was to make a case for the murder of each one of these, Nixon would be facing charges of multiple count of murder, for murder, for the deaths of these. But Nixon, along with his other predecessors, fellow presidents, had never experienced being charged in a court of law for the deaths of hundreds, let alone thousands of innocent civilians in places around the world where they had committed American troops to commit interventions in the name of the American people. After Nixon, of course, I already discussed the military actions authorized by Gerald Ford as president. To the best of my recollection, his authorization to seize a U.S. merchant vessel in the waters of Kampuchea, resulting in the deaths of a number of American sailors themselves, not to mention the deaths of a number of Kampuchean soldiers, would be one that I would consider at least questionable. In comparison, of course, to the crimes committed by American presidents, this might be the least of them, or in an exceptional sense. But I wouldn't discount the gravity of it if one were to count each life as being precious that was lost through the unauthorized or illegal authorization of the use of force, and in this case, Gerald Ford, of course, authorized one. I believe this involved the USS Mayaguez, if you recall, USS Mayaguez, which was a U.S. registered merchant vessel that was captured by Kampuchean forces within their own waters. So the Kampuchean forces had within their rights under international law to control their waters and to regulate the use of these waters and to hold accountable vessels that were plying in their own territorial waters. Jimmy Carter's human rights policy is not much worse than the paper it is written on. Why I say that? That's because far from being an idealist, Jimmy Carter was a pragmatic leader. And by that, I meant that when it came to maintaining the friendship of the Indonesian dictatorship, which has been in power since 1965, Jimmy Carter would rather keep the friendship and support of that dictatorship over and above the human rights of the Indonesian people and over and above the human rights of the people of East Timor. East Timor has been waging its struggle for independence from Portuguese colonialism since Portugal abandoned East Timor in 1975, when Portugal abandoned its worldwide colonies, including Angola and East Timor. And when Portugal abandoned East Timor, the Indonesian military stepped in to fill the void. And the Indonesian military was ruthless. It was merciless in quashing the resistance movement put up by the East Timorese. One journalist who reported on this from Australia was killed by the invading military forces, and another journalist that I heard of described the Indonesian military invasion as digesting, as though East Timor was food for its hungry stomach. So the East Timorese were simply digested by the Indonesian military, and the Indonesian military was able to do this with support from the U.S. during the presidency of Jimmy Carter. So I would say Jimmy Carter would qualify as a war criminal through this policy by having authorized the expansion of U.S. military assistance to the Indonesian military, knowing that the Indonesian military would use this not for any defensive purposes, but for aggressive purposes, not against a foreign enemy, but against their own people. And this, of course, is a gross violation of human rights. Following Jimmy Carter, of course, Reagan came into office, and Reagan is known for expanding, or rather famous for supplementing the counterinsurgency movement or policy by adopting what we call low-intensity conflict, LIC, or waging low-intensity warfare. And low-intensity warfare as a policy was an implementation of an expanded doctrine of supporting insurgents that could be co-opted by the U.S. or which the U.S. could use to pursue its own global interests. So instead of being anti-insurgency, the U.S. supported the insurgency by the Taliban and the Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. The U.S. supported the insurgency of the UNITA guerrilla faction in Angola. The U.S. supported the insurgency of the Contra guerrillas in Nicaragua. So Reagan took the insurgency policy one step further by complementing it with a pro-insurgency policy instead of purely an anti-insurgency policy. So this allowed the U.S. to befriend and to train and to support and to be allied with terrorists. So this enabled the U.S. to support the Contras as insurgents in Nicaragua, knowing that the Contras were actively engaged in acts that we would call terrorism, such as blowing up of schools, blowing up of farms, blowing up of utility plants, including the blowing up of the harbor on the Atlantic coast of Nicaragua, resulting in the destruction of a third-party vessel and the death of a third-party person. And consequently, the Sandinista government took the U.S. to court and presented its evidence before the World Court. And the World Court subsequently rendered a judgment to the effect that the U.S. violated international law, the U.S. engaged in terrorist acts through the CIA, and that the U.S. should compensate Nicaragua. Instead of obeying the order of the court, the U.S. Gave the court the equivalent of the middle finger and never compensated Nicaragua. And when a right-wing reactionary government came into power in Nicaragua following the defeat of the Sandinistas, the United States managed to extract a concession from the Chamorro government that the Chamorro government, the Nicaraguan government under Chamorro, would drop the claim for compensation against the U.S. I'm sure that there were exchanges that were made, gifts or assistance that the U.S. government may have given to the Chamorro government to induce the Chamorro government to drop the claim. But that does not negate the fact that the U.S. engaged in actual terrorism against another people. And this happened, of course, under Reagan. And Reagan, of course, known for his cowboy image as an actor, proved that to be quite the case as a cowboy president, because he was quick to use the U.S. military when it came to intimidating independent-minded countries or governments, such as those by Muammar Gaddafi of Libya, when he sent U.S. warplanes to bomb Gaddafi's headquarters or residence, or Reagan's order to deploy U.S. Marines in the Grenada, or in Reagan's intimidation against Iran and labeling it as a terrorist state. At the same time that he felt free using the Ayatollah's money when he sold surplus U.S. military material to Iran in exchange for Iranian money that he could then divert for use by the Contras in Nicaragua. This came, of course, to be known as the Iran-Contra scandal, or the Iran-Contra affair. So under this, Professor Chomsky is absolutely correct that Reagan qualifies as a war criminal. Following Reagan, George Bush Jr., Senior, sorry, George Herbert Bush Senior was infamously known for his invasion of Panama, and of course this entailed the unprovoked, overwhelming use of U.S. military might to quash a small country, just for the purpose of getting one person, that was Manuel Noriega, who at one time was a loyal CIA operative, but simply because he fell out of favor with the U.S. government, that he's been demonized as a dictator worthy of capture and trial and imprisonment. His authorization for the invasion of Panama resulted in the documentation through film by documentarians that won an Academy Award, It's called, I believe, The Great Deception or something to that effect. I'm not sure the exact title. But this film was about the U.S. Invasion of Panama that resulted in the deaths of many, rather hundreds of innocent Panamanian citizens in the city of Panama. Entire neighborhoods were burned down, and scores of Panamanian citizens were rendered homeless, and many, many more were killed through the indiscriminate use of helicopter gunship firings and the land invasion by the Marines themselves. This is well documented, but unfortunately, none in the mainstream media cares to talk about it. But then again, under the Nuremberg Charter and various other international legal laws, humanitarian and human rights laws, that George Herbert Bush Jr. Sr. would qualify as a war criminal. George Bush Sr. was succeeded by Bill Clinton. Under Bill Clinton, the U.S. engaged in a number of military actions. Famously, his authorization of the U.S. Air Force beyond the 90 days allowed in the War Powers Act of 1974 to bomb and strafe presumed Serbian positions in Serbia and around the Balkans. And this resulted, of course, in the destruction of property and lives of various innocent civilians, not only all throughout Serbia, but also all throughout the Balkans. And his authorization was in support of the NATO operations, presumably to support the Bosnians in their bid for independence from the former Yugoslavia, which was resisted by the Serbians, but which the NATO forces, including the U.S. Government, supported. And in the famous Rambouillet round of talks, Rambouillet was the name of the French town which gave the name of the agreement. The Rambouillet agreement was a program to take away the sovereignty of Serbia and transfer that sovereignty to NATO. So again, this was part of a pattern which has been ongoing, and that pattern is regime change, wherein the U.S. and its NATO partners, in this case, would collude with each other in the overthrow of a government that they didn't like. So the U.S.-NATO program in the Balkans went beyond protecting the human rights of a people that were perceived to be being oppressed. So the U.S. authorization for the use of U.S. military forces in the Balkans under the presidency of Bill Clinton resulted in the deaths of hundreds, if not thousands, of innocent civilians in the Balkans. Even the destruction of property, including the bombing of the Chinese embassy in Serbia, famously denied by the NATO as accidental. But I believe, and if one was to do serious research on this, that it can be shown that in fact there was a plot to target the Chinese embassy in Serbia. I think that the crimes committed by Clinton, with his authorization of the use of force in the Balkans, would be matched by his authorization of the use of military forces in the enforcement of what we call no-fly zone over Iraq during much of the 1990s up until the beginning of the U.S. war against Iraq in 2003. So we have over a dozen years in which the United States, through the imposition of the so-called no-fly zone, engaged in grievous human rights abuses and violations of international law, because the enforcement of no-fly zone was simply a pretext to destroy civil society in Iraq, to destroy the civilian infrastructure in Iraq, including the destruction of water treatment plants, bridges for civilian use, marketplaces, even hospitals. And of course, this not only resulted in direct deaths of many innocent civilians, but also led to the eventual but preventable deaths that could be traced to the destruction, for instance, of the civilian infrastructure. Let me give you an example. The destruction of water treatment plants would, of course, disrupt water supply and would disrupt the normal life of a civilian population. Absence of flowing water, running water, from the treatment plant to the sink of an ordinary Iraqi family would, of course, deny the use of water for cooking, for washing, for cleaning, and would predictably lead to otherwise preventable deaths like dysentery. So dysentery is a preventable disease, but how can you prevent diseases like dysentery if you don't have water? If you prevent the exportation to Iraq of items like cleaning alcohol, because of the language used in the resolution, to the effect that no items of dual use can be exported to Iraq. And of course, alcohol is an item that is susceptible to dual use. You can use it for military or you can use it for the civilian. In this case, of course, it's unlikely that rubbing alcohol, a bottle of rubbing alcohol, would have any military utility, but it could be used to disinfect utensils. It could be used to clean utensils that might otherwise transmit diseases. And because of this, many innocent civilians in Iraq were killed, and this would qualify as a war crime if only there is an investigation and charges filed. So again, Professor Chomsky is right on this score. Uh, what we're talking about Iraqi casualties. What about American casualties? Keep in mind that in the 1991 Persian Gulf War, very few American soldiers died from direct hit from Iraqi forces. However, thousands of American soldiers died not from Iraqi bullets, but from exposure to depleted uranium used by the US military. And depleted uranium, where in the form of dust, in the form of smoke, that may contaminate the air, or that contaminate the food, or that may contaminate the soil or the ground, if and when an American soldier inhales the fumes that contains depleted uranium, or steps on the ground that contains depleted uranium, that soldier is exposed and he or she carries it back with him upon his or her return to the United States. And thousands upon thousands of American soldiers that have served their country patriotically have been denied the necessary assistance, treatment, much less treatment, by the Veterans Administration that these soldiers deserved. I think the American government is a criminal in this regard. US presidents that have ignored this have committed a crime by ignoring this crime against their own citizens, against their own fellow citizens, against people who have served or who thought that they have served patriotically and dutifully their own country, and yet their own country, their own government has turned its back on them. And this is very sad. And I think that the leaders of the government and of the US military have to be held accountable. And someone has to go to prison. And to this date, as I speak, no one has been held accountable. We have plenty of evidence. If one only cares to look for this evidence, one could easily find. The mainstream media ignores this issue because the mainstream media also has vested interests in keeping this issue under wraps. So from Clinton to Obama, the same sorts of crimes continue. Under Obama's presidency, the US military also has used depleted uranium in Afghanistan and in Iraq, especially. The Geneva Conventions forbids the use of certain weapons, weapons that are disproportionate to the purpose of the mission, such as the utter destruction of the city of Fallujah when the US military besieged that city and authorized the use of phosphorus as a prohibited weapon under international law. Much like during the Vietnam War, the US President Nixon authorized the use of I forget the name of that. No, not Agent Orange, but that petroleum bomb that sticks. Yeah, napalm bomb. Sorry, thank you. That sticks on your skin and burns and stings. So under George Bush Jr. and Obama, these types of weapons have been used. knowing that these weapons are prohibited under international law. Under Bush Jr. and Obama, another violation, sad to say, of international law has occurred. And this pertains to their authorization of assassination as an instrument of U.S. foreign policy. Under George Bush Jr., he authorized Dick Cheney to form a task force to create a list of who can be assassinated. So this committee, which is under the authority of the president, can decide who lives and who dies. And this is, of course, under international law, a violation. Obama has carried on the same policy of allowing a committee to draw up a list of persons that would die or live. And of course, we saw as two examples, two persons in the list that would die and who were eventually assassinated. We have Osama bin Laden, and we have Anwar al-Maliki, a U.S. citizen at that, who was assassinated in his hideout in Yemen. But two basic principles of American justice include due process of law, equal protection of the laws. These laws were absent. These laws were totally destroyed by the assassination authorization. When George Bush decided to invade Iraq in 2003, it was done so under the pretext that Saddam Hussein had something to do with 9/11. And of course, this was a totally bogus argument. Saddam Hussein had nothing to do with 9/11. He had nothing to do with Al-Qaeda. And the U.S. decision to invade Iraq, therefore, was totally unjustifiable under international law. It was unprovoked. Iraq did nothing to provoke the U.S. And provocation under international law might include, say, ranting on the part of the enemy leader. Saddam Hussein wasn't ranting against the U.S. It would also include mobilization of Iraqi military forces along the borders of the U.S. Or Iraqi naval activity near the shores of New York or Florida. None of that was happening. So there was no military provocation on the part of Iraq to warrant it being invaded by the U.S. So again, the concept of preemptive war as interpreted by the Bush administration, which was under international law, allowable only if there is clear evidence of military provocation on the part of the enemy. Even if no shooting war has yet begun, the U.S. war against Iraq would be totally unjustifiable and would therefore qualify as a war of aggression. With regards to Afghanistan, the U.S. also committed an aggressive war because Afghanistan was not a party to 9/11, and Afghanistan did not do anything to show military aggression against the U.S. The only sin that Afghanistan under the Taliban were alleged to have committed was their alleged refusal to hand over Osama bin Laden to the United States. But because of the Bush rhetoric that if you give shelter to a terrorist, that you become a terrorist yourself, that became the rationale by the Bush administration to go ahead and invade Afghanistan. Of course, this is against international law. Afghanistan was a sovereign country. It was entitled to its own territorial integrity, and it was also entitled to its own domestic due process. The U.S. involvement in the war in Libya is again another fine example of how the U.S. has violated international law. Under the guise of humanitarian intervention, the U.S. and NATO forces have killed more innocent civilians than they charged Gaddafi to have killed before the U.S. intervention. Furthermore, the UN Security Resolution authorizing no-fly zone, UN Resolution number 1973, I believe, authorized only a no-fly zone. It did not mention regime change. Regime change was the private agenda of the US and the NATO, but they did not have to explain it outwardly or publicly because it would never get approval had they said it offhand. But what they needed as a pretext was a no-fly zone resolution, which they did from the UN Security Council. And once they got that, that's all they needed to use the armed might of the US and NATO, not only to support the rebel forces, but also to go ahead and destroy Libya's military infrastructure, its civilian infrastructure, and to assassinate Libyan government leaders, including ultimately, through the use of lynching, Gaddafi. So Obama is liable under international law to be charged as a war criminal, not only through his assassination policy. And a professor from NYU, Professor Philip Alston, has already described through numerous interviews and his writings about the policy of assassination. He was a UN rapporteur, and he has investigated the U.S. Policy on assassination, and he did discuss this. And so under Obama, the policy of assassination has increased. In fact, it has worsened. Under Obama, privacy laws were tightened, invading the privacy of private citizens. And yesterday, he signed into law a piece of legislation that would essentially make the United States a battleground in which American citizens could be detained and interrogated and punished as though they were in a foreign battlefield. So Obama's authorization of assassinations and Obama's involvement without due cause in a war in Libya, his use of private contractors to replace U.S. military soldiers is a guise to continue and perpetuate U.S. military presence in Afghanistan and in Iraq and in various other places. So Obama is perpetuating U.S. imperial policies. There's nothing progressive about that. So if you believe that Obama is a progressive president, he has got you fooled. I think that progressives in this country need to reassess him and evaluate his policies and not to be taken by his false promises.